In August of 1944, the sound of boots on the staircase of a building in Amsterdam ended more than 2 years of hiding. The door that opened that day marked the beginning of a destiny from which few returned alive. The name of Anne Frank would become a universal symbol, but for decades a question accompanied every memory of her diary. Who had pointed out the address of the hiding place? The traces of that morning were collected in incomplete reports, in versions that never fully coincided, and in suspicions that circulated without conclusive evidence. No theory managed to close the circle. The known documents provided pieces, but not the final picture. Was it really a conscious betrayal, or the result of a chance event that ended up revealing what no one should have discovered? The raid on Prinsengracht 263. On the 4th of August of 1944, a 33-year-old SS agent named Karl Josef Silberbauer, who worked as a sergeant in the unit in charge of tracking down hidden Jews, was in his office on Uterpeststraat Street in Amsterdam when the phone rang, and although he was about to go out to eat, he decided to answer anyway. He would later say that he regretted that decision, because on the other end was his superior, Lieutenant Julius Detmann, also German, who informed him that he had just received a call reporting the presence of Jews hidden in a building located at Prinsengracht number 263 in the city centre. He did not mention who had made the report, but it was clear that it was a reliable source, someone the SS intelligence services already knew, because at that stage of the war, anonymous reports were common, although many ended up being false or too late. This time, however, Detmann reacted immediately, which indicated that he firmly believed the information was valid. After that call, Detmann contacted the Dutch sergeant Abraham Kaper from the Department of Jewish Affairs and ordered him to send several agents to the location along with Silberbauer. Kaper chose 2 Dutch policemen, Gesines Gringhuis and Willem Grutendorst, who also worked in that unit, and a 3rd detective joined them, thus forming the group that minutes later would head to the hiding place. There are different versions about what happened before and after the agents' arrival at Prinsengracht, but all the accounts coincide that they found 8 people in hiding: Otto Frank, his wife Edith and their daughters Margot and Anne, in addition to Herman van Pels, his wife Auguste and their son Peter, and the dentist Fritz Pfeffer. All of them had lived hidden for 2 years and 30 days, a situation the Dutch called onderduiken, a word that meant something similar to submerging or disappearing. Being unfairly detained is already hard, but living in hiding for so long, without being able to look out the window or go out on the street, without breathing fresh air and having to be silent almost all day so as not to be discovered by those who worked on the lower floors, was a different experience, one that required enormous mental strength and constant fear. Even so, they continued with a discipline that few would have endured. During those hours when they could barely speak in a low voice or walk on tiptoes, they dedicated themselves to studying, reading, or writing. Otto spent time with novels and history books, especially those by Charles Dickens. His daughters studied languages and mathematics, and both Margot and Anne kept a diary where they wrote their thoughts, hoping that one day everything would end and they could return to living a normal life. Outside, the Nazis and their collaborators continued to search for people like them in every corner. That summer, the news that came from the hidden radio that Otto had managed to keep gave them some optimism. After the Allied capture of Rome and the Normandy landing, it seemed that the end of the war was near. When they also heard that a group had tried to assassinate Hitler, it filled them with hope and led them to make plans for afterward. Margot and Anne talked about returning to school, not imagining that the raid was about to arrive. Otto said years later that everything happened around 10:30 in the morning. He was on the upper floor, giving a lesson in English grammar to Peter van Pels, and just as he was correcting the word double, which Peter had written with 2 B letters, they heard loud footsteps coming up the stairs. It was not something habitual, since at that time everyone kept absolute silence so as not to give away their presence to the employees of the building. The door opened and a man appeared, pointing a weapon at them. He was not wearing a uniform. They raised their hands as they were ordered, not entirely understanding what was happening, while they were forced to go down to the lower floor. When they got downstairs, Otto and Peter saw the rest of the group also with their hands up, in complete silence, without crying or screaming, just paralyzed by fear and surprise. It was then that Otto noticed a man in a green uniform, who he thought was from the German police, although in reality it was Silberbauer. Later, Silberbauer would state that no one had pointed a weapon, but Otto always insisted that this was not true. His account was direct and coherent, unlike that of many SS members who over time only sought to protect themselves. The calm with which they reacted seemed to irritate the officers, who ordered them to gather their things because they would be taken to the Gestapo headquarters. Anne took her father's briefcase where she kept her diary, but Silberbauer took it from her, emptied its contents, the plaid-covered diary and several loose sheets, and filled it with the few valuable belongings they found, such as some money and Pfeffer's package with dental gold. At that point in the war, many of the confiscations were no longer for the Reich, but for the agents' pockets. It was that gesture that allowed the diary to be saved. If Anne had carried the briefcase with her, they would have probably destroyed it, or lost it in the SD offices. The agent's greed ended up being the reason why her story is known today. At that moment, Silberbauer noticed a grey trunk with metal straps that had the name of Otto as a reserve lieutenant in the German army. He asked him where he had gotten it, and Otto replied that he had been an officer in the First World War. Silberbauer was surprised. He said that had he known, they would have sent him to Theresienstadt, which supposedly offered different treatment, although Otto did not reply. He knew that that place was not what the other imagined. He remained silent and watched as the agent looked at him firmly, as if saluting a superior, before starting to go up and down stairs, saying out loud that they should take their time. Otto recounted that the German went up and down as if he had lost control. He interpreted it as a sign of the respect that military hierarchies still generated, although he would later also say that, if Silberbauer had been alone, he might have let them go. It was unlikely, especially because of what he would do afterward. Once he handed the arrested to the truck that would transport them, Silberbauer returned to the building and confronted Miep Gies, one of the employees who had helped those in hiding. He did not arrest her, perhaps because she was also Austrian, but before leaving he asked her with contempt if she was not ashamed of having helped that Jewish garbage. When, in 1963, a journalist located him, Silberbauer said he did not remember those people because they were no one important. He stated that, if it had been a general or someone known, he would remember it, but that at that moment he was only thinking about going out to lunch. He added that he now had to carry all that matter as if he were the victim, and wondered who had caused so much fuss, implying that it was the fault of Simon Wiesenthal or some official who wanted to look good with the Jews. He already knew perfectly well that this Anne Frank they were talking about had died of hunger and typhus in Bergen-Belsen, but he said it as if it were of no importance. 2 years behind the bookshelf. The place where the Franks, the Van Pels and Fritz Pfeffer hid, was not very spacious or comfortable, but it became their world for more than 2 years. It was located behind Otto Frank's office on Prinsengracht, a street in Amsterdam with canals, bicycles and worker traffic. The building had a warehouse downstairs, a workshop, an office area, and at the back, a hidden annex behind a bookshelf that served as a secret entrance. That back part of the building, with no windows facing the street, was where 8 people lived in secret for 25 months. Anne Frank began to write in her diary shortly after arriving at the hiding place. She had been given that red-covered notebook with a lock on her birthday in June of 1942. From the beginning, she wrote naturally, as if she were talking to an imaginary friend she named Kitty. She did it frequently, even in the most tense moments. That diary was her way of expressing herself, of venting, and also of staying sane in the midst of confinement. The days in the hiding place had strict schedules. In the mornings, until the workshop workers left, everyone had to keep absolute silence. They could not run water, walk with firm steps, or even flush the toilet. The Van Pels slept in the main room on the upper floor. Fritz Pfeffer, the dentist, shared a small space with Anne, which caused constant arguments. Otto and Edith Frank had their own room, and the girls, Anne and Margot, slept in narrow beds, with furniture that creaked if they moved. Once the company staff left in the afternoon, they could speak in a low voice, turn on the lights with caution, and move with more freedom. The curtains always remained closed. The annex was so well hidden that from the outside, no one could suspect that there was anyone there. Mrs. Kleiman, Mr. Kugler, Bep Voskuil, and Miep Gies, Otto Frank's loyal employees, brought them food, news, books, and anything else they might need. They risked their lives every day, knowing that if they were discovered, They could be arrested or worse. Anne wrote about what they ate, often potatoes, carrots, and cabbage, because that was the only thing they could get. She also noted what she missed most: the fresh air, the sky, the birds, laughing with friends, and the simple act of walking down the street. There were days when she wrote with hope, thinking about the future, about everything she would do when the war ended. Other times she felt trapped, irritated by the friction with the adults, frustrated by the lack of space and by not being able to speak freely. As the months passed, Anne changed. At first she was more childish, complained frequently, fought with her mother, and argued with Fritz Pfeffer over every detail. But then she began to reflect on herself, on the world around her, and on what it meant to live in confinement. She wrote about politics, about the speeches on the radio, about the bombings they heard in the distance. She became interested in deeper topics and showed a maturity she had not had before arriving at the hiding place. Sometimes she would peer through the crack in the attic window, from where she could see a small piece of the sky. She would observe the trees, the clouds, and if she was lucky, a ray of sunshine. It was her only connection to the outside. From there, she wrote about how beautiful the world was, despite everything that was happening. In one of her entries, she said that she believed in the goodness of people, despite everything. Living together was not easy. 8 people in a reduced space, unable to go out without real privacy, with constant fear, hunger and heat in summer, cold in winter. Arguments were frequent. Anne felt that her mother did not understand her, that she demanded her to behave like an obedient and quiet girl. Instead, she had a special relationship with her father, whom she respected and admired. She also grew closer to Peter Van Pels, with whom she shared some conversations in the attic. At first she found him boring, but over time an affection arose between them that Anne described in her diary with contained emotion. During the winter of '44, the situation worsened. There was less food, more raids, and discouraging news about deportations. However, Anne continued to write. She dreamed of being a writer, of publishing a book about her experience. She rewrote some parts of her diary, correcting the style, thinking about a future reader. She didn't know if she would survive, but she wanted to leave a testimony of what she had lived. She made an effort to tell not only the sad things, but also the human, the daily, the small things that made that hiding place a real world. In one of her best-known entries, she wrote that she wanted to be useful, to leave something that mattered. She felt she had a talent for writing, and that if she got out of it all alive, she would take advantage of it. Sometimes she felt like an adult, other times she was a child again. She was afraid of planes, of footsteps on the street, of rumors about betrayals, but she also had hopes, like any teenager. Life in Amsterdam continued its course, although with restrictions, controls, blacklists and arrests. The Jews who remained in hiding lived in constant fear. In the case of the Franks and the others in the annex, that fear was present in every noise, in every unexpected doorbell, in every shadow that moved near the building. But there were also routines: studying, reading, doing accounts, cleaning, cooking with the little they had. Each person tried to maintain their sanity in their own way. Anne described everything in detail, from how they made bread with limited ingredients to the discussions about who should clean the bathroom. She was meticulous, observant, and also sensitive. She did not hide her emotions, but expressed them carefully, seeking to understand herself. She was not only a teenager in confinement, but someone who sought meaning in what she was living. For a time, there was hope. The news about Allied advances, German defeats, the liberation of some territories, all that fed the idea that they would soon get out of there. Anne wrote with more enthusiasm. She thought about the future, about publishing a book, about studying journalism. There were days when she smiled, when she felt that every hour of confinement would make sense if they managed to survive. In one of her last texts, she made it clear that she did not want to live like everyone else, that she wanted to make a difference. Her words were not grandiloquent or embellished, but direct, sincere. That clarity was part of what made her unique. No one in the hiding place knew how much longer they would resist, but everyone believed they would succeed. Although the outside world seemed to be collapsing, inside the annex there was a routine, a structure, a way to stay afloat. Anne Frank, with her notebook and her pencil, turned that confinement into words, and those words into memory. From Frankfurt to Amsterdam, life before the confinement. Otto Frank was born in Frankfurt in 1889 into a wealthy family that had been part of the German Jewish community for generations. His father, Michael Frank, was a banker and had raised his children with values of discipline, study, and responsibility. Otto had served in the German army during the Great War and had later tried to make his way in the business world. He married Edith Hollander, also from a well-positioned Jewish family, and together they formed a peaceful home in Frankfurt. They had 2 daughters, Margot in 1926 and Anne in 1929. During the first years, the family led a fairly stable life. Otto worked at the family bank, and Edith took care of the house. The girls grew up surrounded by books, games, and visits from relatives. They were part of a cultured middle class, integrated into German society, which did not see Judaism as an obstacle, but as a cultural heritage. Otto was not religious, but he respected traditions. However, from 1933, the situation changed completely. Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor in January of that year, and from the beginning his political discourse made it clear that Jews were considered enemies of the state. Otto noticed the tension very early on. His contacts in the business world informed him of the changes in the atmosphere. Laws began to restrict the participation of Jews in public jobs, in universities, and in commerce. Verbal aggressions on the streets became more frequent. Many families began to think about leaving the country, but not all of them knew where to go or how to start over. Otto, who already had a practical mentality, decided to act before the situation worsened. He used his connections to look for opportunities abroad. The most viable possibility was Holland. There, Jews could still move with some freedom and set up businesses without too many obstacles. In the summer of 1933, Otto traveled alone to Amsterdam to explore the terrain. He got a position in a company that produced pectin, an ingredient used in the production of jams. The company was called Opekta, and Otto took over the management. The Dutch environment seemed suitable to him. The city was peaceful and tolerant, so in December of that same year, Edith and the girls joined him. At first, they lived with relatives while they looked for a house. They soon settled in a house on Merwedeplein Street in a residential neighborhood in the south of Amsterdam, where other German immigrants also lived. Margot and Anne adapted quickly. They learned Dutch, made new friends, and started going to school. Anne was an active, cheerful, curious girl. She liked books, animals, and writing stories. Margot was more reserved, diligent in her studies, with a quiet character. The family tried to recover a normal life despite what they had left behind. At home, they spoke German, but on the street and at school they used the local language. Otto worked tirelessly to keep the business going and provide security for his family. Although he closely followed the situation in Germany, he tried to keep his daughters away from that hostile climate. Over the following years, more acquaintances and relatives made the same journey, leaving Germany for Holland. Amsterdam became a place of refuge for many German Jews fleeing Nazism. Some thought it would only be temporary, others began to build a new life. Otto helped whomever he could. He used his position to find jobs, facilitate contacts, or simply provide company. Although he was a discreet man, he was generous with those who needed him. However, the problems were not long in crossing the border. In May of 1940, the German army invaded the Netherlands in a rapid and effective operation. In a few days, the troops occupied the country, dismantled the government, and placed Nazi officials in command. From then on, they began to apply the same anti-Semitic policies that had already been established in Germany. The warning signs became visible. Jews had to register, hand over goods, and leave their jobs. Life in Amsterdam changed gradually but constantly. At first, some thought the measures would be temporary. Others believed that since they were not Dutch citizens, they would be less exposed. Reality proved the opposite. Otto tried to keep his company running, but since Jews were forbidden from managing businesses, he was forced to transfer Opekta to 2 of his trusted employees, Johannes Kleiman and Victor Kugler, who accepted the responsibility of appearing as owners to prevent the firm from being confiscated. A new company, Pectacon, dedicated to ingredients for sausages, was also opened, in which Herman van Pels, a refugee butcher of German origin, collaborated. Everything was done with caution so as not to arouse suspicion or attract sanctions. In parallel, the restrictions multiplied. Jewish children were expelled from public schools. Families could not go to the movies, to parks, or use public transportation. Jewish shops were marked. Identity documents carried a J movements were controlled. Anne and Margot began to notice these differences. They did not understand why they could no longer see certain friends, why they could not go to certain places. Otto tried to explain only what was necessary, without alarming them, but also without hiding the truth. They knew they were in danger, although they still did not know how much. By then, many were already talking about hiding. Some families had found refuge in farms, basements, or back rooms. Others tried to get visas to flee to different countries, although the possibilities were scarce. Otto wrote to several consulates, such as those of the United States and Cuba, looking for any way to get his family out of the country, but he did not succeed. The bureaucracy, limited quotas, and lack of guarantees made it impossible to finalize an exit. Given that reality, Otto began to think of an alternative, to create a hiding place within the same building where his companies operated. For months, he analyzed every corner of the Prinsengracht building. There was a back annex, separate from the rest of the building, with rooms and an attic. It was discreet, not very visible from the street, and with an entrance that could be hidden. It was small, but enough to house his family and maybe someone else. He spoke with his trusted employees and began to prepare the place in secret. Beds, wardrobes, and a small kitchen were installed. Everything had to be ready without attracting attention. Otto did not know when it would be necessary to use it, but he was convinced that the time would come. Meanwhile, Anne continued to write, and Margot focused on her studies. Edith tried to maintain the domestic routine, prepare meals, and stay calm. Although they knew that each day was more uncertain, they tried to maintain some normality. Otto continued to go to the office, pretending that everything was still the same, but the cordon was closing in. The raids increased, the rumors grew, the arrests were more and more frequent. The city became quieter, more watched, more fearful. Jewish families disappeared from one day to the next. The streets that were once full of children now showed closed windows and doors without names. In that context, Otto Frank made a definitive decision. They could not continue to wait. The time had come to act. The machinery of persecution in Holland. On the 3rd of October of 1941, the General Governor for the occupied Netherlands, Arthur Seyss-Inquart, established a new order that directly affected the entire Jewish population. From that day on, every person considered Jewish by the laws of the Reich had to register with the local administration. The measure was not optional. The obligation was disseminated in newspapers and on posters placed on the streets. In a matter of weeks, more than 140,000 people were officially classified as Jewish by the state. The data was collected in detailed forms and then carefully stored. This information base would later allow police operations to be executed quickly and without room for error. The Nazi authorities would not have been so successful without the operation of a precise administrative machinery, controlled from Amsterdam but supported by thousands of Dutch employees. The forms were reviewed, classified, and connected with other existing databases, such as civil censuses or school lists. From there, special identification cards were issued. Jewish citizens always had to carry a card marked with a red J on the back. They were also obliged to hand over their radios and bicycles. They could not access parks, theatres, or public places. The rules were applied rigorously, and every infraction was reported. Meanwhile, the Dutch police continued to operate with their own structure, but increasingly subordinate to German interests. The police stations kept their local chiefs, but they integrated liaison officers from the Sicherheitsdienst, the Reich's security service. In the internal reports, one word was repeated: cooperation. It was not just about following orders, but about actively participating in the process. In several cities, mixed patrols roamed the streets to ensure that Jewish citizens complied with all the provisions. If someone was reported, they were immediately arrested. The participation of Dutch officials was extensive and documented. The civil registries were guarded by employees who carried out their work normally. There was no massive sabotage or information leakage. The documents remained accurate, updated, and accessible. When the German authorities requested a list of Jewish residents in a certain neighborhood, the corresponding file was already ready. The arrest warrants were prepared by technical teams. They were printed on official paper, signed by Dutch supervisors, and distributed to the agents. Then the raids were planned. The arrests were usually made at dawn. The agents arrived in unmarked vehicles. They knocked on the door, read the name of the person being sought, and proceeded with the arrest. Sometimes they allowed the detainee to collect some belongings. On other occasions, they gave no margin. They were taken directly to a transit centre, such as the Hollandsche Schouwburg Theatre, and from there they were transferred to Westerbork. Westerbork was not officially a concentration camp. It was a classification and transport centre. The conditions were harsh, but not extreme. The detained people waited there until a train to the east was organised. Every Tuesday a convoy left for Auschwitz or Sobibor. The journey could last several days. There were no windows, barely any water. On occasion, wagons with sick people, small children, or the elderly were included. Age did not matter. The deportation was systematic. Everything was registered. Names, dates, times, quantities. There was no improvisation. Every movement was backed by forms, copies, and stamps. The figures showed the magnitude of the process. Of the 140,000 registered Jews in the Netherlands, more than 107,000 were deported. Of them, fewer than 5,000 survived. The rest died in the extermination camps. The statistics left little room for doubt. It was an operation executed with administrative, police, and civil support. Although the orders came from the Nazi regime, their application was possible thanks to the collaboration of thousands of Dutch citizens. Some did it out of conviction, others out of fear or convenience. There were neighbours who reported others due to suspicion, personal conflicts, or economic incentives. There were also those who helped hide persecuted people, but they were the minority. In the legal field, the Dutch judges continued to work during the occupation. There was no suspension of the judicial system. The courts accepted the new laws imposed by the Germans. Appeals were limited. If a person tried to challenge their classification as a Jew, they had to present complex evidence. In most cases, the decision was already made beforehand. The process was slow and frustrating. Even when an exception was achieved, it could be revoked. The civil authorities did not offer protection. Instead, they facilitated the procedures. One of the key elements in the effectiveness of the system was the use of rationing cards. Every citizen needed a card to access food, clothing, or basic products. The cards were issued by the municipal authorities. If someone lived in hiding, they could not obtain them. This forced many people to take risks and ask acquaintances for help. The cards were stamped with names and addresses. If one fell into the wrong hands, it could be used to locate someone who was trying to hide. The scarcity of authentic cards led to the formation of clandestine networks that produced forged documents. But even that had risks. If a forger was discovered, they could be imprisoned or deported. The radio was also an instrument of control. Since 1941, Jewish citizens were forbidden to own radios. The official stations broadcast propaganda. News from abroad was blocked. Even so, many people secretly listened to British stations or coded messages. The police carried out inspections. If they found a hidden radio, that was enough to initiate an arrest process. In several documented cases, it was that detail that triggered the capture of entire families. The silence of religious institutions also contributed to the sense of isolation. Protestant churches maintained their ceremonies, but avoided references to Jewish suffering. There were exceptions, such as some pastors who helped hide children, but it was not the norm. The Catholic community adopted a similar stance. The Archbishop of Utrecht expressed his rejection of the deportations, but his message was limited and did not generate a coordinated reaction. The Jewish communities, for their part, were disjointed. The prohibition of public meetings, the closure of synagogues, and constant surveillance made it almost impossible to organize a response. In schools, segregation was rapid. Jewish students were expelled from public centers and transferred to specific institutions. Teachers were also separated. The classrooms were emptied. The curricula were modified. The use of certain books was forbidden. History was rewritten. References to Judaism were eliminated. Education became another tool of ideological control. Families that tried to keep their children in private or Catholic schools were watched. Companies also played a central role. Many companies accepted Aryanization, that is, the forced transfer of Jewish businesses to non-Jewish owners. The process was supervised by special committees. The assets were evaluated, a new administrator was assigned, and the activity continued while the former owners were completely excluded. Some were briefly employed as advisors but were then fired. The profits kept flowing. The economy did not stop. It just changed hands. The Dutch administration was not the only one to collaborate, but its technical and bureaucratic efficiency allowed such a high number of people to be tracked, detained, and eliminated without margin for error. Comparisons with other occupied countries showed clear differences. In France or Belgium, the deportation rates were lower. In Denmark, most Jews escaped to Sweden. In the Netherlands, on the other hand, the reports were sent punctually. The trains left every week. The files were complete. The offices remained open. All that made it possible. The unsolved case, an impossible investigation, is born. For decades, the mystery of who had betrayed the Frank family remained unsolved. There were theories, rumors, partial documents and suspicions, but no real proof. Everything that was known had been scattered over the years among archives, memoirs and incomplete police notes. Despite public interest, no team had gathered all the material with a modern approach, nor had they systematically cross-referenced the data. Until a diverse group, who did not come from the traditional field of historians or Holocaust memorials, decided to try. Instead of starting from suspicions, they wanted to start from the facts. Their intention was not to tell a story, but to solve a crime. The team was baptized with a clear and direct name, Cold Case Team. It was promoted by Peter Van Twisk, an investigative journalist with years of experience, along with former FBI agent Vince Pankow. He was an investigator with experience in dismantling international criminal networks, not in studying the European past. But that contrast was exactly what they were looking for. They also brought together a criminologist, an archivist specializing in the Second World War, several data analysts, historians, a lawyer, and even a documentarian. In total, more than 20 people of different nationalities and with different profiles committed to working for years without pay, with the goal of solving the case. The driving force was the void. No one knew who had reported the Franks, and no one had managed to put all the pieces together in a coherent way. One of the first decisions was to assume nothing. Not even what was said in the best-known books was taken as a basis. They gathered more than 900 documents, some never analyzed before, from different archives, including interrogation records, records from the Jewish Council, post-war intelligence reports, and statements from neighbors. Everything was digitized and uploaded to a system specially developed for the investigation. It was a relationship analysis software based on artificial intelligence that allowed them to cross-reference dates, names, locations, family relationships, and links with the police or the Nazi Party. The system generated connections that humans would not have been able to see easily. For example, it identified which people had been near the hiding place at the time of the arrest, or which ones had links to informant networks. They worked as if it were a current case, not a historical reconstruction. The main archive was the NIOD Institute in Amsterdam, where documents related to the German occupation and the persecution of the Jews are kept. There were files there that had never been cross-referenced with each other because they came from different sources: judicial testimonies, administrative lists, and personal notes. Archives from the Jewish Council, which had been forced to collaborate with the Nazi administration and whose documents still generate debate about the responsibility of some of its members, were also consulted. The team decided not to pass judgment and to focus only on verifiable facts. One of the biggest challenges was the fragmentation of the material. There was no single file on the Frank case. What existed was a scattered mosaic. In some cases, there were contradictory versions. For example, some testimonies stated that the raid had been carried out by local police, others said it had been organized by the Gestapo, and others that it was a joint operation. They reviewed police reports from the time and found details that helped to specify how the raid system worked. They found out that many times the denunciations were anonymous and that a call was enough to activate the procedure. They also discovered that there was a special unit in Amsterdam dedicated to searching for hidden Jews that received financial incentives for each arrest. This data was partly known, but the team managed to order it chronologically and establish a logic of action. Another key source was the investigation that had already been attempted in 1963, when the prosecutor Fritz Kolfschotten briefly reopened the case based on new testimonies. Although that investigation did not reach any conclusion, the documents from that period contained useful details. Lists of suspects from that time, signed statements by neighbors, and internal notes from the prosecutor's office were recovered. Some names appeared repeatedly, but their direct relationship with the case had never been proven. The team decided not to discard anything, but also not to take any of those lines for granted. During the first months, the team established a database with more than 4,000 names of people who could have been involved directly or indirectly, either because of their proximity to the hiding place, their participation in the Nazi administration, or their having had contact with the Franks. Each one was assigned a probability level based on their presence in the documents and their closeness to the time of the arrest. The artificial intelligence system updated that level as new information was added. It was a technical and cold job, which avoided any type of personal intuition. They also faced ethical objections. Did it make sense to investigate a crime after so many decades? Should a name be revealed if there was no absolute proof? Could pointing to a dead person who could not defend himself be justified? The team decided that it was not about judging, but about understanding. If they found a convincing explanation, even if it could not lead to a court, they could at least offer a coherent account based on facts. The main motivation was not to punish, but to close a wound that had been open for too long. The collaboration with technology companies was fundamental. IBM developed an adapted version of its data analysis system, and other text mining experts contributed with tools to analyze scanned archives, even the poorly preserved or handwritten ones. Algorithms were used to detect language patterns, semantic relationships, and cross-appearances of names in different contexts. It was a pioneering use of artificial intelligence applied to an unsolved historical case. The investigation also generated rejection. Some academics considered that it should not be treated as a police case but as a collective tragedy. Others doubted the precision of the digital tools applied to historical documents. There were discussions about the public exposure of the project and about the limits of technology, but the team continued. They were not looking for unanimity, but for clarity. They wanted to know if it was possible, after so many decades, to answer a simple question: who had betrayed the Frank family? Throughout 5 years of work, they discarded hypotheses, reconstructed information routes, verified municipal archives, traced social networks, and cross-referenced everything with the dates of the raid. They did not limit themselves to analyzing what was written. They also studied what had not been said, what had been omitted or left out. The absences also spoke. The lack of documents at some key points helped to establish lines of suspicion. The method was slow, meticulous, and collective. There were no solitary intuitions, but a group analysis that was refined with each new finding. The result was not immediate. For a long time, the team only accumulated material without being able to establish a firm hypothesis. But little by little, they began to notice that certain names appeared more than expected, or that certain coincidences were repeated. A figure began to stand out, not because of what was said about him, but because of the way he fit into the general system. That conclusion had not yet been presented. The team was not yet ready to say it out loud. First, they needed to verify everything one more time. So, without cameras, without published books, without speeches, the cold case team continued to reconstruct a truth disarmed by time. Everyone was a suspect. Since the war ended, questions about who could have betrayed Anne Frank have not stopped arising. The authorities at the time tried to answer them, but the chaos of the period after the occupation complicated everything. The Dutch police opened several files and interviewed dozens of people, although few results came from those efforts. For decades, the unknown remained intact, and over time suspicions were divided among several faces from the hiding place's close circle. No one seemed to be completely free of doubt. The first group to be analysed was that of the neighbours themselves. In a building like the one at Prinsengracht 263, the walls were thin and any unusual noise could attract attention. The members of the investigative team thought that someone from the adjacent or upper floors might have noticed strange movements, footsteps at odd hours, or even murmurs. There was one woman, particularly mentioned in old reports, who lived on an upper floor and seemed to have a watchful attitude. However, there was no evidence pointing to a specific report on her part. Police files did not show records that confirmed calls from that area on the day of the raid. The backgrounds of the employees of the company that operated in the building were also reviewed. Some knew about the hiding place, others only had suspicions. One worker in particular had had altercations with Victor Kugler, and there were times when he expressed resentment. His profile was carefully examined, but when the cross-referenced testimonies and his whereabouts on the day of the capture were analysed, no coincidence was found. Another employee, considered reserved and distant, seemed to have had no direct access to the private areas of the building. No suspicious deposits were detected in his bank accounts or links with Nazi collaborators either. Then there were the thieves. The building had suffered several robberies in previous months, which forced the occupants of the hiding place to be more cautious. In one of those episodes, investigators focused on the possibility that the intruders had discovered the secret access and had reported it, intentionally or accidentally. However, after reviewing the criminal records of the time and analyzing the confessions of several arrested, no statement was found that alluded to Anne Frank's hiding place. A line of investigation focused on habitual informants. During the occupation, there were people who obtained benefits in exchange for reporting hidden Jews. Some did it for money, others to gain favors or simply out of ideological conviction. Profiles with this history in Amsterdam were investigated and compared with the records of calls made to the headquarters of German security. Although several names appeared, none could be directly linked to the Franks case. A recurring figure in the archives was a Dutch police agent who had participated in multiple raids against hiding places. His name appeared in documents related to similar arrests at number 263. The investigation included him among the indirect suspects, but there was no proof that he had received the initial information. He did participate in the raid on the 4th of August of 1944, but as part of a broader operation ordered from higher levels. The orders for action usually arrived without explaining the source of the report. The team also evaluated the possibility that the call had been a random act, unrelated to a direct betrayal. Some raids occurred because German soldiers or SD members decided to inspect buildings at random, motivated by rumors or simply by intuition. Although that theory was not the most accepted, it could not be completely ruled out. In the case of Anne's hiding place, the precision of the operation suggested that someone had given concrete information, but the file did not include the audio or the specific record of the call that activated the intervention. During the years after the war, several people claimed to have firm theories about the informant. A Dutch investigator proposed the idea that a worker in the building had been responsible, based on indirect comments and suspicious attitudes. Another theory pointed to a delivery man who frequented the area, but his link to the hiding place was never proven. In the 90s, a book was even published that pointed to an employee of the company as guilty, although the evidence was circumstantial and did not withstand the analysis of other experts. Each theory generated new documents, interviews, and debates. The cold case team had to carefully review all those versions, separating facts from opinions. Analysis programs were used to detect contradictions and gaps in the stories. Many witnesses had already passed away, but their past statements were recorded in press archives, private letters, and memoirs. The compilation took months, and as they progressed, the doubts did not decrease but multiplied. It was even considered that the hiding place had been discovered by accident, without a prior denunciation. Some German agents carried out searches following patterns of observation of resource consumption, excessive spending of bread, electricity, or water in buildings where officially few people lived. This method had allowed other clandestine refugees to be discovered. The team looked for whether that pattern could be applied to the Franks case, but there were no coincidences between the distribution records and the inspection movements on that street. There were also suspicions directed at a couple who lived nearby and who had shown signs of sympathy towards the Nazi occupiers. Some witnesses mentioned that these people made negative comments about Jews and that they carefully observed what was happening in the environment. But post-war documents did not record concrete actions that implicated them in denunciations. Without material evidence or direct witnesses, that line of investigation was discarded due to lack of support. As the possibilities were analyzed, one thing became clear. All roads led to inconclusive endings. Each name yielded a hypothesis, but none with enough weight to close it. The investigation became a map full of routes that ended in silence or contradictions. Even Otto Frank, after leaving the camp and returning to Amsterdam, tried to find out the truth. He asked former employees, spoke with neighbors, and reviewed papers, but he never managed to find out who had made that call. Some say he preferred not to know. The cold case team faced the same frustration. They had more tools, more time, more access to sources, but also more versions to deal with. The passage of time had not made the scene clearer, but had covered it with layers of memory, forgetting, and interpretations. Everything seemed to indicate that if there was an informant, it was someone very close or someone who had acted for reasons that would never be documented. Even so, the team did not give up. They continued exploring. Before considering new hypotheses, they had to make sure they had discarded all those that had been repeated for years without reaching firm conclusions. Only then, with that ground clear of common speculation, could they open a path that would lead to a concrete answer. But the road was long, full of traps, and any false step could forever close the possibility of discovering the truth. The shadow of Arnold van den Berg. For years, the letter had been kept among Otto Frank's private papers, without anyone knowing of its existence. It was a typewritten document, unsigned, that he had received shortly after the war. Although its content was clear, Otto chose not to share it publicly for decades. He only showed it to some people he trusted, and kept it as one more piece of the puzzle that he never managed to fully assemble. The message pointed to one man, Arnold van den Berg. It did not say much more, but it pointed clearly enough to sow a suspicion that would last for years. That letter was one of the first documents that the case's investigative team rescued and thoroughly analyzed. It was not new, it was not unknown, but no one had related it to a concrete hypothesis. Until everything began to line up, van den Berg had been a lawyer, notary, and a recognized figure in Amsterdam. He had been part of the Jewish Council, the body that the Nazis created to administer internal affairs of the Jewish community, and which ended up functioning as an intermediary between the German orders and the persecuted population. His name appeared in multiple archives, but never with a direct connection to Anne Frank's case, not until then. The team did not start from a personal suspicion, but from patterns. They cross-referenced thousands of documents in multiple languages, looking for coincidences in names, addresses, relationships, and changes in legal status. Van den Berg began to appear again and again in key places. He was not the only one who had access to sensitive information, but he was one of the few who had kept it very late in the war. While other members of the council were deported, he remained free. That caught their attention. His family had not been sent to the camps, and he managed to remain in the Netherlands at a time when almost all Jews were being deported. There was evidence that he had negotiated with the Nazis to stay safe, which in that context did not make him unique. Many tried to do the same. What differentiated him was that, in addition to protecting his own, he seemed to have in his hands information that could endanger others. Van den Berg was the only one who met all the necessary conditions. Access to information, links with figures of the regime, and personal reasons to ensure the survival of his family. He was not the only suspect, but little by little he became the one who gathered the most coinciding elements. The team did not claim that he had acted with malice or out of conscious betrayal. Quite the opposite. The analysis tried to understand what could have led a person to give information in a desperate situation. Had he been pressured? Had he been threatened? Was it a forced exchange or a desperate attempt to gain time? The motivations were not clear, but the documents revealed a sequence that could not be ignored. Among the papers that were reviewed, there were records from the council that included lists of people in hiding, addresses cross-referenced with inspections, and names that matched the occupants of Prinsengracht 263. Although an explicit list with that address was not found, the team concluded that it was plausible that someone in that environment had known the place. The figure of van den Berg began to stand out, not because he was the only possible one, but because the rest of the theories crumbled due to lack of evidence or contradictions. In his case, the elements were not conclusive, but they were cumulative. A letter, a trajectory, a pattern of survival, a closeness to power, and a prolonged silence that was never broken. When confronted with the data, his family denied all possibility. They said that he too had suffered, that he had lived in fear, that his goal was always to protect his own. No one could prove otherwise with absolute certainty. The only sure thing was that many elements pointed in his direction. Even so, the team did not present the theory as a closed fact. They knew that pieces were missing, but they considered that of all the possible options, this was the one that gathered the most documentary evidence, more logic in its sequence, and fewer contradictions than the rest. It was not a condemnation. It was an attempt to understand. For this reason, instead of pointing to him as guilty, they preferred to reconstruct the context in which he could have acted. A man with connections, trapped in a ruthless system, with a family to keep safe and with information in his hands that could cost him his life. In that environment, no one came out unharmed. Otto Frank and the unfinished enigma. When its mention in the final report became known, some institutions linked to Anne Frank's legacy reacted with caution. The Anne Frank House, for example, issued a statement in which it acknowledged the interest of the work, but pointed out that the information could not be considered sufficient proof for a definitive assertion. The organization avoided taking a single stance on the conclusions and was cautious in its comments. They indicated that they would review the findings in depth, without rushing to confirm or reject the hypotheses raised. Other voices within the academic and social spheres offered diverse opinions. Some considered that the report provided a valid line of investigation. Others insisted that without additional documents or direct testimonies, the case could not be considered solved. This diversity of reactions reflected the sensitivity of the topic and the difficulty of advancing with certainties when a large part of the protagonists are no longer alive. The publication generated international attention. It was discussed in the media, educational forums, and spaces dedicated to memory. Some felt relieved that at least an attempt was made to answer a question that had remained open for so long. Others expressed concern about the impact that an unconfirmed theory could have on collective memory. Over time, the debate lost intensity. It remained in some specialized spaces, but it no longer occupied the main headlines. The case, far from being closed, remained in an intermediate point. It was not just about establishing who had done what, but about understanding how a system where everyone was exposed worked. Today, the case remains a reference, not only for what it reveals about the past, but for what it poses about how societies remember. The discussion remains open. What remains is a set of documents, partial testimonies, and silences that cannot be completely filled. The figure of Anne Frank continues to be a symbol for millions of people, but her story also includes the questions that were not resolved, the data that still generates doubts, and the decisions that, for various reasons, were never explained. The silence in this case is not just an absence of information. It is part of the history itself.